That's one of the things I wanted to get across, that individuals act as state apparatuses and impose the subjugation upon others and themselves.
Welcome to Unsafe Space, everyone. I'm Carter Laren. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Anything you can do to share our content does help us grow. If you think you're already subscribed on YouTube, you might want to double check. Sometimes Susan likes to unsubscribe people for who knows what reason. You can also support us financially by going to unsafespace.com, where you can buy merchandise. There's lots of cool stuff there, or you can just donate. Either one of those things do help us keep the lights on here. Recently, we invited Dr. Michael Rectenwald back to the show to discuss his latest book, Thought Criminal. It's his first novel and also the selection for this month's Unsafe Space Book Club. For those of you who don't remember him, Dr. Rectenwald was a professor of liberal studies and global liberal studies at NYU from 2008 to 2019. He also taught at Duke University, North Carolina Central University, Carnegie Mellon University, and Case Western Reserve University. His scholarly and academic essays have appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, Academic Questions, Endeavour, the British Journal of the History of Science, College Composition and Communication, International Philosophical Quarterly, the de Gruyter anthologies Organized Secularism in the United States and Global Secularisms in a Post-Secular Age, that's a great title, and the Cambridge University Press anthology George Eliot in Context, among others. He holds a Ph.D. in Literary and Cultural Studies from Carnegie Mellon University, a Master's in English Literature from Case Western Reserve University, and a B.A. in English Literature from the University of Pittsburgh. Professor Rectenwald is a pundit and champion of free speech and opposes all forms of authoritarianism and totalitarianism, including socialism, communism, social justice, fascism, and political correctness. As the notorious The Anti-PC Prof on Twitter, he has appeared on numerous major network political talk shows, on syndicated radio shows, and on numerous YouTube shows and podcasts, including this one. In addition to Thought Criminal, he's also the author of multiple other books, including Springtime for Snowflakes, Google Archipelago, and Beyond Woke. You can follow him on Twitter at The Anti-PC Prof, and you can find more of his work at michaelrectenwald.com. Dr. Rectenwald, Michael, welcome back to Unsafe Space.
Thanks for having me.
I love talking to you, and I know you're a very prolific writer. You've written lots of other books. You've written poetry. You've written fiction, but this is your first novel. Thought Criminal is your first novel. Can you tell me a little bit about, was the process different? Was it harder, more fulfilling, less fulfilling? What was it like?
It's much harder than anything else. It's harder than academic discourse. It's harder than writing for op-eds for general audiences. It's harder than technical writing. It's harder than anything else I've ever tried because there's so many difficulties. One of them is, of course, the plot and making things move. I didn't have any trouble with that here because I set up a scenario such that the action had to go from the conditions that I imposed on the story, and it just unraveled from there. I didn't plan the plot. I didn't know where it was going. There were a couple possible directions, and I wasn't sure which one I would actually take. But it almost was like a thought experiment in which I got the characters into these difficult predicaments and then tried to work their way out of it. So that worked that way. The difficulty about long fiction is you got to keep track of so much. Did I have him wearing a hat? Where'd it go? Did I have him carrying such and such a thing? Well, you can't forget that. You have to do something with it. And, then you have to go back and see if everything's consistent with what's been said before, and then edit. And it makes it kind of interesting. So I had a lot of that. So that made it more difficult. But the hard thing about long fiction is just keep going. It's just keeping going. And just, I think most people have trouble with plot. And this is actually a very plot-driven novel. So that wasn't really a problem, luckily. I thought it would be. I thought that would be the problem, but it wasn't.
Yeah, and I think it must be even harder to do a futuristic novel in which the universe itself is something that you have to keep in your crow mentally, because it's not the real universe that we're in.
Right. First of all, you have to create the world in which action takes place. And that's the hardest thing about fiction, but it's even harder with science fiction because you've got to create all the elements. You can't assume anything exists then, in the future that exists now. So you have to reproduce things and make different things and then make them make sense with reference to each other and make sure they're not obsolete with reference to other things. And the technologies have to be, and I tried to make them credible and that is that, this is a possibility that could actually happen. And so I tried to keep the technology workable in a hypothetical way, but nevertheless still not, completely fantasy. It's not fantasy fiction. It's actual science fiction, so that it tries to maintain some scientific credibility.
Yeah, you can imagine a world in which this stuff is happening.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you can imagine a world
Unfortunately,
in which
yeah.
this stuff is happening.
Yeah.
Now, we'll get into maybe some spoilers later, but let's do it at the end of the show, and I'll warn the audience before we get into spoilers. So if they want to drop off, they can. But without any spoilers, could you maybe give people a teaser or an overview of what's the book about?
Yeah, I mean, this is a book about a future in which there is this professor of AI and neuroscience who is in theory of mind, who when a virus panic hits, he has a theory about the virus, and the virus he thinks is actually being propagated purposefully by the state, by the state of pandemos, which is a global state, and that his hunch is that the virus actually consists of nanobots that attach to the neurons of the neocortex and conduct information flows between the subject and this vast database and processing system that is the technological architecture infrastructure of the state, called collective mind. And so the object for the protagonist and a few others is to find a way to stay disconnected from collective mind, because it overwrites they think it'll overwrite your own thoughts and eventually, as such, displace your personality. And so you won't be yourself at all. So that's the premise of the novel.
Now, I think it was Kenneth Timmerman who wrote The Election Heist that called this the 1984 of the COVID era.
Yeah,
And
pretty kind.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about was, did you conceive of this story prior to COVID, or was this inspired
in the middle of
by
it?
COVID?
It was right in the middle of it. Some of the things that were happening in the COVID predicament made me decide to create a viral scenario that wouldn't be the same as our own, but then would still draw from elements of what was going on. And so there's lockdowns and there's prohibitions about how many people can meet at once, and there's the same sort of desolation we saw with the lockdowns at the outset in March and April, where all the streets are empty and everybody is basically locked down, and then there's all these prohibitions, and also you have to wear this mask, but in this case it's like a full bubble mask that covers your entire head, and that you have to use a small lightweight oxygen tank to breathe, which attaches to like your belt. And the virus definitely was the impetus for the setting, no question about it. But also not just the virus, but all the behaviors that were attendant upon the virus. And you'll see that a lot of the themes in there have to do with this thing called collective mind, which is this, this collectivizing force, this collectivizing technology that basically erodes individual autonomy and selfhood. And so these are some of the things that I saw going on with reference to the virus, and I just made it material, turned it into a technological artifact as opposed to just something that was kind of imperceptible but nevertheless noticeable.
I was going to ask you about that specifically because it did, it's this kind of like Durkheimian concept of the collective consciousness, which is this
Mm-hmm.
difficult thing to nail down, and you chose to make it this concrete. I guess you introduced this technology whereby there's something concrete that acts as the agents of this collective consciousness, so we can kind of see it more clearly
Yeah,
as an audience.
definitely.
I'm wondering why you chose to do that, and what advantages do you think that has for people living in current day to see that?
Well, it gives you an alibi, first of all, that, when you're talking about collectivism or some sort of collective unconscious or collective consciousness, that you have an alibi that this is technological and therefore you can't be presumed to be making it up or imagining it. And second of all, you can't be criticized for collectivizing this mentality as a kind of sociological analysis that's based simply on some sort of a bias or prejudice, but instead it's a manifest entity that can't be denied. So therefore, you kind of have an escape hatch for introducing it without prejudice, more or less.
That makes sense. I mean, you actually, although I don't think this is a spoiler, you actually, I'll quote you to you at the
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the
I
book. You
like when you
say,
do
yeah.
that.
uh, contrary to received notions, collective mind had always been more than a technology. And then you say it was only possible when a collective became complicit in its own subjection, and when the subjects imposed subjugation upon each other. Um, so it's interesting because I feel like at the end, after you've provided that alibi that you say, you kind of pull the rug out and be like, actually, you don't need the tech to see this as well.
That's right. That's right. I wanted to make clear that people are complicit, and actually it involves their necessary belief in it in order for it to function. And then they also become apparatuses of it. They become state apparatuses in their own right. That's one of the things I wanted to get across, that individuals act as state apparatuses and impose the subjugation upon others and themselves.
So something that might strike people in this book is that there's no particularly bad guy. They're not like the evil Thanos. That's
Right.
He's a very clear villain. Who do you view the bad guy as? Is there a bad guy, and who?
The bad guy is like all the other people that they're not visualized or even introduced, but you just know they must be there. These other people that have not resisted this collective mind, that are effectively automatons, if you will, because they're completely taken over by it and they have no subject to it. They have no autonomy. So those are the bad guys, even though they don't do anything nefarious. They just comply. And I guess you could also say the mediastry, as it's called in the novel. They're the propaganda organ of the collective mind of the state too, and so that's kind of a nefarious element. But it's really the it's all cast on this collective mind, really, when it comes down to it. That
Yeah, I was gonna
this
say even the media street is not really functioning independently of the collective
no,
mind. It is a
yeah,
manifestation, right?
right. It's the villainous collective mind. It ends up, and I will give this spoiler away. It ends up in effect killing one of the characters. She suicides herself to it, in effect. She finds no way out of it, and she sees no future. And she's young. That's the other thing. She's young, and so she hasn't had any time to see how things can be dealt with. Just as we see in this COVID panic, a lot of young people committing suicide because they see no future, no way forward. This happens in the novel.
Yep. Well, since you went into you opened the spoiler gate, let's just I've
I
got
did.
I got some questions both about Ginger suicide and Rolf Barnes's destruction. They're both a couple cases where there was this pain that was introduced of like, okay, this is a good person that we liked who's dead or destroyed effectively.
Yeah.
Rolf Barnes's fate. Um, what what was the purpose of kind of introducing? I mean, you've talked about Gingers. What was the purpose of Rolf Barnes's destruction there?
Well, there have to be casualties. I wanted to make it an ending that was victorious, but not without casualties, not some sort of a like a panacea that everybody gets out and everybody's free and all this. There have to be some losses at stake, and also it's aiming to show what these victims of totalitarianism, that there are victims and there are people that die or suffer tremendous damage, like Rolf Barnes. I believe I leave it open where he could have had, probably they may have conducted some sort of a brain surgery on him and totally destroyed his selfhood. They probably lobotomized him or something, because this was the object, just so people weren't thinking. That's the key.
Yeah. You mentioned that they didn't care if they were controlling your mind so long as you weren't controlling your mind.
That's right.
Which is that's pretty dark,
Yeah,
but feels accurate when we relate it to today.
it
What
does feel
about
like it.
yeah? What about Jack Moloch? Is he a hero or a coward or
He's
like?
a coward. He never comes clean and becomes a deviationist, like the other thought deviationists in the novel, of which Varen is, I guess, the preeminent one. He wavers, and he ends up performing the surgery, I guess, on Rolf Barnes and destroying him in order to save himself, so that he doesn't get accused of being a deviationist himself.
Yeah.
So he has to perform this horrible operation, I guess, in order to make sure that he is not, blamed. So it's kind of like what happens under totalitarianism, as the only way to escape is by accusing somebody else, or effectively sacrificing others in order to stay alive, and he does that.
So there's no way for him to to continue existing without eventually doing the evil will of the collective mind.
Yeah, except if he had only known that they were going to defuse it. So his actions actually unnecessary in light of the facts that come out later. But who would have known that they could possibly undo this amazing, powerful database?
I mean, it's interesting how in the end it's relatively simple to undo, because it
Yeah,
just involves it just involves returning control to individuals,
yeah,
um, and it kind of undoes itself.
yeah. It becomes its function becomes moot when it's shut off. In effect, it gets shut off, or its capacity to control gets shut off. But this takes some engineering on the part of Varen and his
Yeah.
robot assistants.
Well, let's talk about his robot assistants because I do have a quick as I know you've done a lot of work either directly or tangentially around transhumanism and
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that whole robotics and genetics and
yeah.
nanotechnology. Why include a deviationist robot? What was the
Because
purpose
one
of?
of the things I didn't want to do was have this thing where robots bad, people good, and that there would be this dichotomy between the robotic and the human. Whereas I wanted to make it such that you could have actually, what if a robot could deviate? What if a robot could actually attempt to attain autonomy from this collective mind, and what would happen then? So I made a robot a deviationist. He's somehow disconnected. He doesn't really know how, and Varens doesn't really. Nobody really knows why or how he got disconnected, but he is, and he starts to become self. He starts to respond to his environment and in connection with his own programming to carry out his own desiderata. So
Yeah.
he is effectively becoming, in effect, more human than some of the people that are still connected.
I was going to ask you about that because it does then bring to mind that many of the humans are more robotic than Bottas is, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of raises this philosophical question, which I'm sure you've thought about and have opinions about, is what what's the like what makes a human, what makes humans special, what's the origin of individual rights? Is
Mhm.
it the human DNA, or is it something else?
That's a great question, and it kind of goes back to this I think, a great essay written by I forget his name actually. It's called "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And one of the things he noted about that is that in Space Odyssey, what is it? Space Odyssey 20. What was it called? Uh,
And which the movie or the
yeah, the
David Bowie
movie
song?
with Hal and
Oh,
how
2001.
yeah,
2001.
2001 Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
And how Hal has more emotionality and is less robotic than the humans that are disconnecting him, that are unplugging him and taking him down. And that was one thing I really have been impressed by, is that the question of, as we implement AI, do we become more like automated technology, and the AI itself become more like humans, so that we lose our humanity while they gain something like humanity, and we become stupid while they actually gain intelligence. So that's one of the things I wanted to get across there, and that that the division is not along genetic lines, or even along species lines, or even along organic versus non-organic lines, but something else. I'm not sure I ever light on what that something else is, other than to call it autonomy.
I was gonna say it's something related to autonomy, and I would even say uh, maybe not accepted responsibility, but like ultimately responsibility for your own actions. Like it's that kind of autonomy that's somehow seems like is suggested in the novel is somehow related to where humanity comes from in that.
Yeah, there's self-ownership is, I guess, the real
That's a good way to put
principle.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
self-ownership, which
Yeah.
is a libertarian concept, right? That the self is our
It should
property.
be.
Yeah, it
Yes.
should be, indeed. That the self is our property, it's our first property, and it's the property on which all other property rights are based, and without which we have no rights at all.
Right. And
So,
over which we have independent control when left to our own devices, right? Like,
right,
and
which leaves you
so,
responsible and leaves you, like Farron, making mistakes, like accidentally killing somebody,
yep.
and having to own that. Having to own that. Now, Bodis doesn't have to own it in terms of morality, but and he can't quite understand why Varen would be upset. Like, what is the implication of somebody being killed by you, other than what the practical implications? Like, well, he's not there
Could go
anymore,
to jail,
and you
right?
could
Yeah.
go to jail. Basically, that's it. He doesn't see any other moral. He doesn't see any moral implications. It's a legal matter for him and a technical matter.
Yep.
Uh, but maybe that gets resolved, because at the end of the novel, he decides that he will not continue with Varen. He will go off on his own and try to be reprogrammed to include emotionality, and perhaps this will add the element necessary to become a moral agent.
So I was going to ask you about that actually. Do you think that Bodis is? Do you think? Well, I guess Bodis aside, do you think that the emotions are necessary for moral decision making, or do you think moral decision making could occur in kind of an emotionless state?
It's possible that it seems like emotions may be either a precondition or a subsequent consequence of a moral agent. So it's the kind of question where in science, oftentimes the cause and effect are conflated in a way. We don't know what's cause and what's effect. And so in medicine, for example, they just add something that may be actually an effect, but it actually works as a cause. And you know what I'm getting at here? Like,
Yeah, yeah. There's a correlation between two things that's clear, but we don't really know what
what the
causation
relationship is. So that's
Yeah.
kind of the gambit that he's hoping to, by adding emotion, perhaps, since that seems to be concomitant with it, with moral agency, perhaps this will bring it on.
Yeah, because he makes a statement about humans behaving how we would perceive as immoral, and his assumption is that it's because they're not in touch with their emotions or not.
Yes,
They don't
they
feel.
don't feel anything. Right.
Right.
Some
Yeah.
people could carry out monstrous acts. And I think he's speaking here like about agents of the state who carry out monstrous acts without any emotional reaction at all. And then others that do minor things and feel overwhelmed by guilt and
Right.
and remorse and things like that. So I think that's right. That's the connection he's trying to make around,
Why'd you want Varin to play a role in Faustin's death? I mean, you brought it up. What was the?
I wanted to prove that unlike fantasy, people don't judge others very well often. They make mistakes about other people. I do this myself. I have poor judgment about other people. Generally, on the opposite end,
we've all done that.
I assume everybody's good, and I assume everybody's smart, and I assume they have the best intentions, and then I find out maybe sometimes otherwise. So I give everybody the benefit of the doubt. He's paranoid about it.
Understandably so, though.
Yes, totally understandably. So I wanted to make a flip where Faustin ends up being a deviationist, an very unsuspecting deviationist, because he seems to be running the whole show of taking the deviationists in and basically making sure that they are disinfected, i.e. infected with the virus. Right. This is one of the things that I wondered if people, how that came across reading, that infection, according to the state, was actually disinfection for the person, and that being infected was actually, or being disinfected actually meant you were infected.
I mean, I can only speak personally. Yeah. I mean, that particular device spoke, like, I really liked that particular device because it felt, it mirrors how I feel about modern discourse generally, that we're living, I mean, it's why people say that we're in clown world or opposite land or whatever sometimes. It's that kind of ridiculousness.
Everything is the opposite of what is being said.
Right.
And so to have the virus means, according to the state, if you have the virus, means you don't have it.
Right. And they need to clear you. They need to fix you to make sure you have the virus, but they're calling it, vaccinated.
They're calling it a cure, a vaccine. Yeah, they're calling it prevention against the virus, when in fact what it does is make sure the virus works constantly as opposed to possibly intermittently, that there's no way to have that it controls your thinking to such an extent that you can't shut off the inputs from collective mind, but vis-a-vis thinking on your own. That part was fun. I liked the chapter where I talk about how the virus and vaccine work. That was fun.
Yeah.
Brought back my science days. I used to be a science student.
You've been a not science student for quite some time, though, I think.
That's right. At this point. But I did work in AI for 5 years.
Okay. At CMU, or where were you at?
Carnegie Mellon, as a writer. Okay. No, I wasn't a programmer, but I had to look at their crazy shit and try to make sense out of it as to what it was doing. So, and I got the jargon and the concepts of what AI was attempting to do. So that helped.
Yeah. Well, let's actually, we touched on this before, but it's something that's really interesting to me, and I know you have expertise here. A lot of people are afraid of transhumanism generally. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in one of your articles, you wrote an article titled "The Titanic and Transhumanism."
I did? I forgot all about that. Wow. How did you find that? My God. I don't even know. That's buried so deep, I have no idea that exists.
Well, I'm going to tell you what you say in this article.
because I don't remember at all.
You're giving an example of someone who is opposed to transhumanism, and you're using Francis Fukuyama as the example. And you say, the philosopher Francis Fukuyama argues that our notion of individual rights depends on a stable human nature. Changes to human nature undermine the secular foundation for morals and ethics. When some human beings are enhanced by GNR technologies, Fukuyama insists, the dignity and respect accorded to the unenhanced will diminish, their human rights will erode as the enhanced argue for privileges based on their generally acknowledged superiority. And I guess my question is that's kind of a Fukuyama seems to that quote or of yours about Fukuyama seems to really encapsulate, I think, what a lot of people are nervous about when it comes to transhumanism. And I know you're not a Luddite, so what is your view on this, and how would you respond to people like Fukuyama? Are you
Well, I taught I taught a segment in a course on transhumanism every year. I guess that's where I used the Fukuyama essay. I forget what it was called. I think it's just called Transhumanism, in which he makes that argument, in which he says that when others are enhanced, that our rights depend on this equality. And this equality is this stable human nature. So when you enhance some people, they become unequal with reference to the rest. So therefore, they have more rights. Well, I don't buy into that at all. I don't think that some sort of de facto equality is necessary for human rights. If I believed that, then I would say we couldn't have human rights right now, because I don't believe anyone is equal to anybody else. Not in a de facto way, only de jure. Basically, we grant an abstract set of rights to people based on their participation in the human species. Now, I'm not a transhumanist, but I don't like those kind of arguments against it. My arguments about transhumanism have to do more with not that I'm afraid of enhancements or technologies or improvements to the human subject, supervening our human, lost our capabilities, overcoming obstacles. I forget, there was a reason or an article in Reason in which he basically suggested that we became transhumanists when we started building fires and making wheels, that we already, when we were wearing glasses and any other prosthesis that effectively to take us from our natural state and give us a sort of more than natural condition. So those are not the issues for me in transhumanism. The issues for me is basically that, and I wrote about this in an essay called The Singularity and Socialism when I was still a socialist, by the way. And that essay basically gets into the question of who is going to control this technology and what they're going to do with it. And my contention is still that is, and the novel plays out this question very well, I think. I mean, well enough. We could talk about the literary merits or lack thereof, perhaps. But the idea being that the transhuman future will not be distributed equally, and it'll likely get into hands of control, like, for example, what we have now, big tech and oligarchs and the state. And therefore, it won't represent, like Kurzweil suggested, this singularity moment in which basically gives birth to God. But as I said in Google Archipelago, but rather gives birth to an outdoor prison system that will basically be used to totally control us and incapacitate us, while seemingly handing out enhancements to us. This will be the inducement that will believe that these are enhancements, but they'll actually be used as control mechanisms. So that's my basic problem with transhumanism.
Right. And I mean, I think that makes sense to me. I know this isn't a question, but now I'm now wanting to riff on this a little bit because it's an interesting topic to me. And
Sure.
to me, it means that philosophy is all the more important right now because it's that, if you have a system in which you don't have liberty, if you have authoritarian control, any technology that's introduced will exaggerate the power dynamic that's
Oh
there.
yeah,
And if you have liberty, maybe it will exaggerate liberty, and that will be great. But
yeah,
if you don't, it'll exaggerate the opposite.
that's right. I agree with that 100%. And so that's why I guess in the novel, the precondition for the setting up of collective mind is already a state of that lacks liberty. Otherwise, it couldn't have happened like this, where these authoritarians or totalitarians get total control, and then they are under the control of this as well. Um, that's the other question I don't probe too much in there, but I really have in my mind is what happens when AI becomes the dictator? If AI becomes a dictator, does then the ruling elite even become subject to it as well? Are they also uh, are they also prisoners in effect, or is there some way out? So that's one of the reasons in the novel I have a chapter in which I basically suggest that the core of essential data is still human. That there's still some humans there that are able to overwrite the programming of the database in order to effect certain ends. And that's definitely a necessary condition because otherwise we could be subject to AI dictatorship.
It seems to me that it, again, to get back to the philosophy stuff, what's really necessary is if you have a very clear if you have a very clear understanding or description, I'll say, of or definition of where individual rights come from, what
Mm-hmm.
constitutes an individual, and what, getting back to answering that question before we were
Mm-hmm.
talking about, is what makes something, quote, human.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then you don't have to be afraid of a super powerful AI, because it will also respect your autonomy and individual
Mm-hmm.
rights if those principles are embedded in part of culture and society, and therefore in the AI programming.
That's right.
It's kind of safe. But if you start saying, well, it has some nebulous thing to do with our genetics, you're now automatically pitting humans against machines in a way that
Mm-hmm.
seems pretty dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. I think you're right there. That's why I don't try to put it in those essentialist terms. That in fact there is the possibility of, like I say in Google Archipelago, I'm not opposed to AI or many of the things that they can do. They can do for us, like enhancements of all kinds, and even genetic rewriting, such that we could obviate disease and so on and so forth. Uh, I guess the question is, the premises that the people working on it are operating from, which is always why I've been very nervous about the fact that the people that are running big tech are authoritarians and they don't value individual autonomy and rights.
That's
That
right.
in fact they're creating SJW bots, if you will, and
Yep.
that's the worst thing ever.
Yeah. No, that's the scary thing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
SJW bots are the scariest thing I can imagine, and then we have not only just people canceling us, but we get canceled by these bots. And these bots are also detecting our deviationist, tendencies and all this. This is frightening in my view.
Yeah. And when you couple it with the uh at least I'll say my belief, because I don't have proof of this, but I think there's empirical evidence to suggest that you can't actually suppress technology forever. You can suppress it a little bit, you can delay it, you can outlaw things and whatever, but eventually it's going to surface. And that means that if we don't have our ducks in a row from a cultural and philosophical perspective when this stuff surfaces, we're in a lot of trouble.
No, that's a great point. That's the best way to put it, really. Unless we have the premises understood and established, and what in fact are the values, and what are the principles on which we operate a
Yep.
society. Without that, then we could succumb to the kind of programming that will end up hemming us in.
Yep. Yep. Can I this is maybe a weird thing to say, but it's been something that I think about whenever I hear the word transhuman.
Mm.
I've decided personally I don't like the word transhuman, because humans, their primary means of survival is their functioning, reasoning mind. And
Hmm.
so anything that's a product of our mind is inherently human.
Hmm.
I kind of reject this concept of, well, that's transhuman.
Hmm.
Because to be human is to think and use your
Yeah,
rational mind to change the world around you and make your environment better.
that's
How does
true.
that strike you?
Oh, that strikes me just fine. And it does draw it does sort of suggest that we wouldn't be so awed by our own technologies in a way, such that we would accord those who are wielding it a transhuman capacity. Whereas if we just see them as improved tools and technologies, like others in the same, they're not of a different register entirely. They're qualitatively different, but they don't escape they don't sort of come like in a Hegelian dialectic. There's not this dialectic of quantity and quality such that at one point it becomes something else.
Right.
Uh, and I think that's the predicament that people talk about transhumanism are in. That there's something about the technology that takes us out of ourselves. It isn't ourselves doing it as such. It's
Right.
there's a qualitative difference they see between the technologies of the past and these future technologies or these present technologies, such that we become something else.
But we already are kind of something. I mean, I don't
We
know.
already are. Yeah.
The smartest, I will say the highest IQ person I ever knew was my boss from 20 years ago. He was a world renowned cryptographer. He was like a savant, a very, very smart guy. And he viewed his computer as an extension of his process, like his processing power in his brain. And he was an extremely fast coder. And you could
Mm-hmm.
ask him a question. He literally had a script compiler open on his computer all the time. And during conversations, he would like type in little programs and execute them to answer
Yeah.
a question that he had. And I thought
I
to
know the
myself,
type. I worked with them. They're very strange, and I like them.
right, right, right. But it made him extremely powerful, right? In
Yeah.
terms of like his mind, he was already really smart, and then he was able to come to answers and figure stuff out so much faster. And I kind of viewed that dynamic as like, well, if that's not quote transhuman, what what is it? I mean, I guess you could embed the chip in his brain, but it slows him down a little bit, but not much.
Well, this brings up an idea. We could say, like Bruno Latour said, we have never been modern. You could say that we have always been transhuman. In effect,
Yeah,
we've always been transhuman.
I
That
think
there's
so.
always a supervening aspect about humanity that's always overcoming itself. Uh,
Because we don't live by instinct,
right.
right? That's
We're
not how we
always overcoming.
survive.
It's a self-overcoming at all times, and that's kind of consistent with Nietzsche, I think, too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Outside of his more hubristic, elements where it's a super ubermensch, that's basically knocking everybody else out of existence.
Yeah. So, do you think that how close are we to the world of Thought Criminal?
Unfortunately, really close. First of all, the technology is right on the cusp. I mean, I did reading to get to this idea. It wasn't like I brought this out of my head, hashed this on my own. This is technology that they're actually developing. I mean, Elon Musk is talking about it, but they're also talking about this kind of virus-like nanobot that actually disguises itself like a virus to the body, to the cells, and they act as if it's a virus, and they're shaped like viruses, and that they sort of imitate the ARC gene, ARC, and that then they pass for part of the body, and as such, they are not rejected as such. Uh, well, I should say they don't get treated like viruses. They get treated like this ARC gene that actually resembles a virus. That part of it is not far off. The other part of it, I think we're there already. That is to say, this collectivism, right?
Yep.
that we're really living in this collectivist nightmare, in my opinion. I don't want to get too spooky, but it's a nightmare to me.
Sure. Sure. Well, I mean, you reminded me of part of the book reminded me of something that Scott Adams talks about people watching two different movies. Um, and there is this sense, and you touched on the arguments against this when we talked about why you concretize the collective mind, so you couldn't be accused of just having a bias here. But there's definitely a sense that, look, there's a large swaths of society that are living in this universe. I guess maybe Marcuse would say the established universe of meaning for these people it's very specific, and it's not necessarily related to reality. It's related to the narrative about reality that's propagating.
Mm-hmm. That's right. You could say they're living on the official narrativity, the memology of the regime. In effect, they're gobbling up these meme streams as if that's reality, and they're not able to pierce outside of it. If anybody can, I think people can. If I didn't think people could, I would give up.
Right.
And I would probably already be subsumed by this meme stream myself, but I don't think that people are necessarily. I don't think people are unable to, and I don't think everybody is actually under it.
Yeah. No. Clearly, not everyone is.
Yeah.
And some of us might, die on boxcars resisting, but
By virtue of this, yeah.
yeah. Do you think that, another parallel I saw here was I almost view this novel, or I'll say the collective agents in the novel, as a modern day zombie story.
Mm-hmm.
Where zombies in the past were the metaphor that people would use to kind of explain this slow marching, stupid ideology, kind of encroaching, but like easy to defeat individually, but en masse impossible to overcome.
Right, because they just keep coming.
Yeah, because there's too many. They just keep coming.
You can't convince all of them, because you might be able to talk one of them into sense, but you can't do that with all. And their programming is so tight. There's no way in. Their programming is so tight that you can't penetrate it. Yeah, they're in a tight wrapped loop of thought or non-thought. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that, like, in the past, when you deal with that ideology, zombie might be a good metaphor because there's some sort of magical, mystical element. But we've modernized enough now that people understand science, and this is maybe a better metaphor for what's actually going on, because you can explain it with some science in a way that I think people can grasp. It doesn't, like I said at the beginning, unfortunately, it doesn't feel very far-fetched.
Yeah, I know. That's what a lot of people say about the novel. This doesn't sound like the future. It sounds like the present.
It's next year. Right.
Yeah. Well, it is a metaphor. Metaphorically, it is meant to describe what's going on. That is, the collective mind is a metaphor for something that's happening now. Right. The virus is a metaphor for something that's happening now, and it's not the virus as such. Something else.
And the virus isn't the problem.
Right. The virus is not the problem.
Right. So do you think, I know we have a limited time, so I want to be respectful of your time. Are you going to do another novel, or are you going to go back to nonfiction? What are you going to do after this?
That's a great question. I'm still deliberating that. Some part of me wants to do fiction, a big part of me, because it's fun. There's more liberation there. And again, you don't have this culpability of being like a conspiracy theorist or something. You're a legitimate conspiracy theorist. There's something about writing fiction that's okay. But if you write this as if this is really happening, suddenly you're deemed this, unbelievably retro, you're this abject horror that, we can't tolerate. You're a heretic. You're a heretic. Right. But you're allowed to do this in a fictional landscape. It's very curious. It makes me wonder about some social issues, and the question of authorship, because Foucault, for all his demerits, said that the first function of authorship was not to own intellectual property or to express originality. It was to find somebody to blame. It made you blameworthy for what you said. Authorship was invented for blaming. So maybe fiction escapes this element of authorship in some sense. That you become less
that makes
blameworthy.
sense.
Yeah.
Right. You look at 1984. You look at the writings of George Orwell or Huxley or Ray Bradbury or Heinlein. Very kind of had a lot of libertarian things to say, but got away with saying them all in fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I wrote it mostly. It's just I wanted to say things that I couldn't say without being discredited if I said them.
Well,
if I said some of the things, oh, you're denying the virus is real, or you're denying this or that, or you're a conspiracy theorist, you think they're perpetrating this on purpose, you're some kind of a nut. Whereas I just created a fictional scenario where they are perpetrating on purpose, and what are you going to do about it?
Right. And then you just have to hope that people aren't so brain dead that they can't draw the parallel to what's happening today.
Right. That's right. If they can't do that, then they're lost anyway. To me, they're lost to me. Yeah.
Right.
So,
well, cool.
Just let me ask you something now that I have your time. Does it work for you, the novel? Did it work? That's how I think novels. They have to work.
Yeah. I definitely felt like I've said, I felt like this is what's happening. I mean, that's why I kind of opened by asking about COVID. I'm like, this is what's happening now. It's too uncanny that you came up with this in like sans COVID. I mean, maybe you could have, I guess, but yeah, I mean, it totally lays it out in a way that I think helps. I think for a lot of people, they might get a little bit hung up on some of the jargon because there is some technical stuff in there that's, I think, difficult for people. I don't know. I can't judge. I'm an engineer.
Yeah.
So
you're a nerd, so you get it. But there's possibility of that.
Maybe.
My son, who's doing the audiobook, said that. He said, boy, there's some technical stuff in here. I'm like, really? I thought it was pretty...
Yeah, I didn't view it as super technical, but I like, reading other novels. I'm like, okay, I don't know if people would they get this? I don't, maybe. Maybe they wouldn't. But I think that happens also. I don't read a lot of science fiction, and that might be normal in science fiction. So
yeah, they go even further than I do,
Yeah.
But some of it becomes fantasy. It just gets ridiculous, I think.
There was nothing in here that I felt like was fantasy. It all seemed like, okay, like this is, I don't know how nanites would work attaching to my neocortex, but I know that they could. So, like, okay,
Yeah, they could.
Yeah, I mean, the only fantastical thing is, and this is just my personal issue with AI, I don't believe that we're anywhere close to self-aware AI. I just don't.
Okay. Yeah, that was always. I tried to keep that an open question. Does it know itself? There was this whole dialogue between Bodis and Varen about collective mind, and he's asking him, does it have a knowledge of its knowledge? And he doesn't quite know how to get at what he's saying. It's like, does he know what he knows that he knows that he knows?
Right.
In other words, is there self-consciousness of such?
Yeah.
And you can't. That's never answered, I don't think.
Yeah. And my personal opinions about AI is just that I don't think we're close. I think a lot of people like to write novels about the singularity and blah, blah, blah. And I know Elon Musk thinks we're close to a singularity. And who am I to disagree with Elon Musk? But I disagree with Elon Musk. I don't think
all
we're
he
close
did
to a
is make an
singularity.
electric car so far. Let's get real. And a rocket. I mean, come on. These are.
Hey, he put a Tesla in space. It was kind of cool.
Yeah. I mean, but that's not exactly the same thing. This could be a quantum leap, really.
Yeah, I think it's a difference in kind. I don't look out at current state of AI. Again, not that I'm an expert, but I am an engineer and I have looked at it.
Sure.
I don't look at the current state of AI and say, "Oh, we're like it's just quantity. We need more of this and then we'll get there." I look at it and say, "It's a difference in kind. We're not there. We're not we don't know anything about how to do that." Actually.
Yes, and that's true. That's actually the state of AI. When I worked in AI, it's distributed intelligence. They were never trying to create like an autonomous, all-knowing self that had the kind of mind that we do. Rather, they distributed different parts of what we call thinking to these different, functionary, what they called agents, software agents. Yep. And these agents only did like one thing, like they relayed something, or they took something in and then they made a kind of discrimination about it based on what they knew, what the database told them they knew, and then spit out an answer. But that's not self-conscious knowledge.
Right.
Or that's not self-consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, and we just don't understand how the human brain works very well.
Right.
Right. And the sad truth is we don't get the human brain. So, although I'd love to have my consciousness uploaded someday, I would be in line for that if possible. But
yeah, I mean, that's not something I objected to either. This idea of this kind of cybernetic immortality, it's not something that I out of religious grounds, I would say no. That's my soul. I would be interested in that, but only if I'm not trapped or feel trapped inside of a fucking box. Excuse my language there.
No. I would want a flush button.
Yes, let me.
This
out
isn't
of
working
here.
out. Delete me.
Yeah, because I'm very claustrophobic, and
yeah,
I don't want to feel hemmed in.
Yeah. Well, remind everyone where they can follow you, how they can read more of your work, both fiction and nonfiction, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, michaelrectenwald.com is the center for all of it. Michael Rectenwald, one word. Rectenwald is Rectenwald, no H, no K. There's links to all the books, either purchased directly from me at Apogee Bookstore on my website or linked to Amazon. I'm not sure which I prefer, because I like the Amazon ratings to go up, but I also like the immediate cash infusion that comes with selling them directly. Either take your pick. If you hate Amazon for because it's this gargantuan monopoly, then buy it direct, and I'll sign it for you and send it off. Michael Rectenwald.
There's an incentive.
Yeah,
you'll sign it if it doesn't come from Amazon.
That's right.
Oh, well, there you go. I'm gonna tell people to don't go to Amazon if they can. Buy it from you directly.
Yeah, buy it directly. That way I get the money right away and you get the book with my signature. And if I know you, I'll write a note.
And Bezos doesn't get crap.
That's right.
That sounds good.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate the conversation. We are reading this book in book club, so we're going to have a book club on Sunday to talk about it, which will be great.
Great. I'd like to hear how that goes.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Okay, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. For your protection, the following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and marked for cancellation. Disavow no later than Monday at 1600 hours, Beijing time, to avoid penalties. Here's a fun lived experience. Hair sniffing is now a medically approved form of COVID-safe greeting. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Technically speaking, cold weather is not evidence of anything at all, but warm weather is proof of catastrophic global warming. Computer voice Curtis, never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.